Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paolo DeMaria. I'm with the National Association of State Boards of Education. Welcome to our webinar entitled How States Can Inspire Student Civic Engagement. I want to make sure you're in the right place, but you are going to be part of an amazing conversation on a very timely and appropriate topic. This idea of inspiring students is, in some ways fundamental to the entire education calling, right? We're all about inspiring students, but this is a particularly important part of that inspirational endeavor, and that's inspiring students around civic engagement. We are, by our very nature, social creatures. We live in community, and by virtue of living in community, we have an obligation to the betterment of the community, and it's really under that kind of idea that this notion of civic involvement, civic engagement surfaces. And the fact that it's really about young people. Old people like me, we're not rarely, absent from civic engagement, but it's the voices of our youth and our young people that we want to find ways to strengthen and do that through things that state boards of education can do and public policy. As I said, I'm the president of the National Association of State Boards of Education. We go by NASBE. NASBE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We are solely focused on supporting the individuals who are citizen leaders on state boards of education as they work to strengthen public education systems so that students from all backgrounds and circumstances can succeed in school, in work, and in life. Our webinar today, once again, is how states can inspire student civic engagement. There are a few norms that I want to go over with folks just to make sure we're all on the same page. And those are the fact that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made publicly available and distributed. We have enabled also closed captioning. We ask that if you have questions during the conversation to use the question and answer function. You'll see that located for those of you who are using a desktop version. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that should support that. You can also look to the chat as a way for resource links. We'll be sharing links throughout the conversation in the chat function, which should be useful to you as well. This webinar is derivative from a recent issue and the most recent issue of our flagship publication, the State Education Standard. This issue was called Civic Ready Students. You'll see the QR code here, which will take you right to the place where you can find it on the web. This was an amazing collection of thoughtful leaders from across the country reflecting on this idea of civic ready students. You'll see some of the articles listed there on the left. And I really would commend it to you because without exception, this is a very thought-provoking issue, especially at this particular time. And as we continue to work on finding ways to make sure we amplify student voice, not only in the way we operate in the education system, many state boards of education actually have student members, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, but also generally in the activities of our government, our democracy, and in our communities, in any manner of civic activity that might exist. We have an amazing panel of experts for you today. These people come to us with great credentials. I have half a page or a page of information about each one, but I'm not going to share that with you because you can track these down and look them up on LinkedIn. But Shawn Healy, I'll start just by introducing Shawn. He leads iCivics. iCivics is an amazing organization that in many ways brings together a lot of the interested advocacy organizations and what have you in the civic space. He heads their state and federal policy and advocacy work. His background, he began his career as a high school teacher in Wisconsin and Illinois, and in fact spent some time chairing the Illinois Task Force on Civic Education and has gone on to do many, many things and have a great influence on civic education, both in Illinois and beyond. Fernande Raine is the founder of the History Co-Lab, and currently she's the co-lead and the chief strategist. She has an incredible background, having completed high school in Germany, and learned about, through that process, the really important role that student voice plays in the context of, you know, promising democracy and emerging democracy. So she became an avid advocate for youth engagement in Germany and beyond, and she's brought that talent to this country as well. Bernice Butler is the executive director of the District of Columbia State Board of Education. She's a dear friend of ours. We love working with Bernice, and she has an amazing Board of Education that she supports and an amazing team. She was appointed to that position back in 2022 and does an incredible job supporting the policy work, the practical work, the board's activities, and managing the day-to-day operations of the agency and the support staff. She is an amazing champion for student voice, and they have two very strong student members of the District of Columbia Board of Education. And finally, here's a student to make sure that voice is given ample attention. Ian House is the student advisor to the North Carolina State Board of Education. He was supported in that role both through the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education, along with other students. And he has also been a champion of the North Carolina Student Voice Connect, which is a statewide initiative that he's been leading to really connect North Carolina students and integrate their voices into education policy. I'd like to welcome everybody to the conversation. And so let's get things started. I mean, you know, to me, the fundamental question to really start this conversation is, why are we having a conversation at all about student voice and civic engagement? Maybe I'm gonna start with that question to Shawn. Why don't you say a little bit about your perspective on the importance of having this conversation, given the current, not only given the current context, but given the current reality that we really want that student voice to play a more prominent role in our civic activities.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the issue dedicated to civic education, the opportunity to contribute and to be part of this esteemed panel. And you're right, now more than ever, we need to lean into universal student access to high quality civic education, and student voice has to be centered to that. And, you know, goes without saying, civic knowledge is at a very low level, right? Our last NAEP test shows that proficiency was at about 22% with eighth graders. Those scores actually fell from previous iterations, but the only NAEP score that's lower than that is U.S. history. There is historic levels of political polarization, maybe that we haven't seen since the time of the Civil War, and then deep distrust, not only of institutions, but of one another. And so it's a difficult ask right now for young people to sign on to this project, right, in constitutional democracy, and develop a sense that, yes, they can make a difference, and that institutions themselves will be responsive to their engagement. But that is the everlasting project, right, to develop some type of allegiance to this system. I know we're going to talk about America 250, but that's, you know, we're rounding the corner to that. And we're going to look back at those founding principles. And it's also important to acknowledge the gap between those founding principles and the current lived reality for our students. So a good civic education empowers young people to help close that gap and to build, in the words of the Constitution, and Abraham Lincoln, of course, used these words, to build a more perfect union.
Shawn, that's great. I'm gonna reflect a little bit on what you just said before I turn it over to Fernande. In Shawn's response, he really points to two really important factors in this conversation. One is sort of this content knowledge, right? It's what do we know about history? What do we know about civic institutions and what have you? And you use NAEP and other assessments of that to kind of illustrate that point. But then there's also this kind of civic engagement dispositions, right? How we comport ourselves, how students comport themselves in the context of being members of the social structures in which we engage. And so we'll get into that a little more deeply, but I wanted to sort of specifically call it out, amplifying what Shawn just said. Fernande, take it away from your point of view.
Well, as a historian and a humanities person, when I hear what Shawn was just saying, I hear that this is a deeper issue of how we've approached the humanities over the last 100 years or so. Given the focus on STEM and the focus on what since, I mean, long before Reagan was defined as a national security issue of American education being a provider of our edge in a world of rapid technological advancement and change, the humanities have been shrunk to a point where some of the core practices that you mentioned have been just stripped out of school. Developing different opinions and finding space for controversy was stripped out. Even like as early as the 30s, it was stripped out. And then we stripped out history. I mean, we left in history, but it was awfully boring, right? Most kids hate, and it's always been boring. Sam Weinberg wrote a devastating book that shows for 120 years kids have found it boring, and 15% can learn this way and 85% can. And we were like, it doesn't matter, who cares about history? So if we don't, it's been boring. And then democracy also was always presented as something fixed and not something young people are invited to improve, right? This is the scripture of the Constitution. This is the scripture of the Declaration, and take it or leave it. And we're not going to talk about whether it's real or not. We're not going to talk about what the challenges might be today. We're just going to take that, and all of the complicated stuff we'll leave for you to discuss at home, which was fine when Walter Cronkite was on the air, right? Or there was a balanced news media. But in a world where the only thing you have is a phone full of disinformation or whatever, that gets hard, right? So I think the moment we're in is a really challenging one where we sort of, not that we built our, we put all the hope for what democracy needed to have as an educational, foundation into a tiny little subject of civics that was an add-on for some schools for a little bit of school, right? Expecting that that tiny little thing can carry the project of making every young person feel empowered to be a member of a democracy. Yeah, that math doesn't add up, right? So I think the interesting thing is just like trickle down economics, we're realizing, gosh, that doesn't always work. Trickle down democracy does not work. And we're realizing that now. And we're like, okay, now what? This is fun. School clearly isn't working. Democracy isn't working. Mental health stuff isn't working. This is a moment of redesign, and where we need to design for civics, for mental health, for learning. And it's an interesting moment where we get to look at this civic and democracy challenge through a holistic lens. So I think it's a tough moment, Shawn, like you're saying, but it's also one where it's like, again, from a historian's mindset, oh, fun, this is a moment where we get to redesign.
And Fernande, the thing I loved about your article is you really took the perspective of developmental psychology, right? These are, and again, we'll be honest that a lot of this discussion is really focused on, our adolescent youth in high schools, right? They're getting at that point where they're starting to understand, their own individuality, where they are in the world, and they're asking those key questions about their, life trajectory and all the things happening around them, and about like, why are these things the way they are? How can, I better understand the way they are? How can I influence the way they are? They see things happening in their neighborhoods. They see things happening in their communities. They see things happening to their friends and their families. And all that puts them in a posture. Sure, they can sit in a class and take US history, but they also can learn extensively by being set out on a journey of discovery. And how do we leverage that? Bernice, I'm going to turn it over to you. You see this in a very real way in terms of the student members of the DC board. Talk to us about why is this conversation so important today?
Well, here in the DC board, I think one of the things that our board takes very seriously is like the board's mission is to ensure students are prepared for college, career, and life. Like this is the life. There aren't you don't get a second chance to be in touch with it. And so when we start thinking about ways in which we can really foster an authentic student engagement in state policy making, it's embedded in why we exist. And so it's like when it comes time to think about what does it mean to have students not just have input in the decision making, but be part of the decision makers, and where their voice is not an afterthought, but really built into the process of the board's work. They have a thoughtful input. They get to make statements on the record on why they disagree or agree. But oftentimes it's also not, well, just because the adults are in the space, you don't get a say. Everything that we are doing, whether it is from tests, like deciding what's on state report cards, to deciding what type of state assessments they have, the attendance policy, the graduation requirements, all of those things impact them and how they will then go out and either prosper in the world, struggle in the world, engage authentically, or whether they will withdraw from that world. And so I think it is vitally important that we know that it's always been the time. I don't know if we've always had the courage and the patience to do the work.
That's a great answer. And I think the other thing before I go to Ian is this notion that sometimes we as adults think, oh, well, a student couldn't have the knowledge to engage effectively on this point. When in fact, I'm continually amazed at the depth of understanding, the perspective, the true knowledge. And a lot of times people that I talk to say, well, won't students want to, do the bare minimum, or only, make it so that things are easier. But no, they actually value learning. They value rigor. They value wanting to gain knowledge that helps them to be successful. And we need to trust in them and value that point of view as we go through policy work. Ian, talk to us about what it looks like from your perspective.
Thank you, and I'm so happy to be here today. And thinking about this question, I really harken back to the point of how government gets its power. And government gets its power from the consent of the governed, through the consent of the governed, that we have a society. And a wisdom of a society is defined as the wisdom of the individuals who constitute it. And it is with this, right? How do we develop those wisdom of individuals? Those individuals are students. They are students who will one day become adults, who will one day have a place and role in society. And we're only able to develop their wisdom is if we give them opportunities to engage civically. And I think that's key right there, because we want students to have hands-on opportunities where they can engage civically, so they can really understand the point of the material that they're learning in schools, because there's a difference between receiving the information, but what do you actually do? How do you use the information? And it's about how do we build opportunities for students to be able to engage with this information, because so many students receive it, but they don't, but they end up not being able to use it as they should.
Great. Very good. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these issues. Shawn, I'm going to start with you because in your article, you really kind of dive into some of the more content-oriented elements, right? About diploma seals, standards, and again, as we look at America 250, our celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. Say a little bit about what should state policy leaders be thinking about in terms of the content side of the civics equation as we look at it through the particular lens of today.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I'd like to start with this basic thought or frame. A bunch of young people across the country just entered kindergarten this fall. They're in the early part of kindergarten, right? And they'll graduate kindergarten next spring. And next July, we're going to shoot off a bunch of fireworks, and we'll have tall ships come into our harbors, and we're going to celebrate our 250th anniversary. And then in 12 years, we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the ratification of our U.S. Constitution. And those same students will graduate high school that year. And I think it's a challenge to all of us. Like, what will we have done during this time period to reinvest in our civic spirit, in engaging our citizenry broadly in these reasons for celebration, right? These are remarkable documents. Just heard Ken Burns say that the signing of the Declaration of Independence was the most important event in world history since the birth of Christ, right? So this critical event. But what will we have done? Because as was implied by my colleagues here, Fernande specifically, for most kids in America, civics is one semester in high school, and that is insufficient, right? So to speak specifically of our recommendations, we recommend a full year of civics in high school. There's only 6 states that do that. Utah is going to be 7 thanks to legislation they passed this year. Schools should have a standalone course on civics, a semester-long course in middle school. Only 5 states are doing that right now. There should be dedicated instructional time for civics in K-5, where this has been virtually hollowed out. New Hampshire passed a law 2 years ago called the More Time on Civics Act that provides civic learning opportunities in K-5. We have to think about this from an assessment perspective, and I'm not talking about bubble tests, but Massachusetts has a project-based civic learning requirement in both middle school and high school. They have a competition for voter registration. How cool is that? And then the topic of my article that I co-authored with my colleagues, Lisa Boudreau and Andrea Benitez, we talked about student and school recognition. So 19 states, 12 of them have a seal for civic excellence on graduation diplomas. And the criteria for that varies. In fact, we go into some detail in the article what that looks like. And I think even maybe more importantly, 6 states, 1 state has a teacher recognition program, which is also very important. 6 other states have school recognition programs. And what I like about those in particular is they think about civics, not just as that semester-long class in high school, but as a school-wide enterprise, right? Where civics is threaded across the curriculum. You do need those footholds for it in a distinct civics class. That we think about civics from an extracurricular perspective. And then maybe most importantly, to your first question, we think about student voice in the governance of the school and really building a small d democratic climate. So those are some of our policy recommendations. Of course, funding is critical, and this is a very underfunded area, but those big pieces, making sure that there's time for civics K-12, and to really embed this as a school-wide and frankly a K-12 trajectory enterprise, and then thinking about that challenge before us as we round the final turn here to America 250.
Shawn, thank you for that response. Fernande, I'm gonna ask you to build on that, because I mean, in some ways we hear the message about the content needs, right? More time, learning about civics, but your piece really talks about it from a developmental perspective, how we should infuse the entirety of the high school experience, which Shawn sort of mentions, right? Integrating those ideas in the context of what is happening developmentally for a student. Say a little bit more about that, and what are the implications for state policy? It's easy for me to write a set of standards for history. It's harder for me maybe to write, like, what should the high school experience look like?
Absolutely. And I think, I love content. I love the all that material, but it's sort of like, when they talk about bioavailable nutrients or vitamins, right? Like they're the kind of vitamins that you take and it just goes right through. And they're the ones that can be absorbed by your body. Like to make civics bioavailable to a young person, you have to understand their operating system. Like, how does it actually work? Because we all know the scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Where they're sitting there asleep and drooling in the history class, because it's basically like flatlining in intellectual engagement in what's going on, right? So what do you need to understand about a teen so that when you're talking about civics, you're getting it, you're creating a hook for what they're looking for. And so what I love about some of the learning that's come out of adolescent development, and particularly Pam Cantor and Mary Helen and Mardino Yang and David Yeager, these amazing researchers, we're about to put out another paper about this, but what they've realized is that sort of the exciting thing about the teen brain during this time is that it is absolutely all the things that are amazing about it are also the things that drive adults crazy in the classroom, right? Like when teachers are asked about teens, most of the adjectives they come up with are things like, they don't know what they want. All they care about is their kids. They buck authority all the time, their friends. They buck authority all the time. They have such strong emotions, all these feelings that get in the way of learning. Now, you're not going to do anything about the fact that that's how teens operate. So what you have to do in order to make any of your learning around civics function is that you build on that. And you say, of course, they don't know what they want. They're looking for things, so they have to be following things they're curious about. You cannot lecture them about a topic. You have to set it up as a way that provides them with a curious and individual, with a hook for them to follow things they're passionate about. Or if you say they really care about, they get passionate about things and they're emotional about things, you have to create space for controversy and conflict. If kids feel like they're only allowed to accept one version, there is no way a teen can do that. Like physiologically, they can't do that. If an adult says this is the way it is, their initial reaction is to say, no, it's not. Like we all know this, our kids, right? So to say, perfect, you're going to challenge. How do we find ways to challenge and create constructive ways to deal with that? Or to leverage the fact that when they are constantly challenging and they see dissonances all the time, right? Between norms and reality. We know this as parents, right? You say, well, this is the norm. And they're like, that's not what you do. Or that's not what you did with my sister. Or that's not what you're like, stop challenging my norms. It's the norm. Okay. Like this is the same thing in civics. We say, these are the norms. And they're like, wait a minute. That's not what the life is like. That's not what the world is like. You can't just say, shut up. That's the norm, right? You have to let them explore and challenge or get curious about, well, what does it mean for this norms? How can we make it better, right? And invite them into that conversation, because shutting that down will just make them think that this is only for the kids who are ready to play by the rules. And we see this all the time. So who are the kids that love civics? They're the ones that are achievers, that feel comfortable in their skin, that know who they are, that feel seen, that feel powerful. Like usually the kids that love civics are the ones that love history. They feel their role in the world. That's awesome. And we love those kids. But the kids that feel lost and not seen and don't find that on-ramp into civics, you first have to build those little on-ramp building blocks. So wait a minute, I see you. I know you don't feel like you have a voice, but let me hear what you're thinking. But that takes effort, right? But without that sense of, I feel seen, I feel heard, I feel like I belong, I feel like I matter, without those key pieces, none of the rest will happen. The civics won't stick. And so I think that's really important to understand, that we have to create spaces where literally every young person somehow in their high school career has an experience where they get to have those light bulbs go off. I matter. My voice is heard. I am seen for who I am. I appreciate other people. Like all the sort of light bulbs of core aha moments that they have to have about themselves and the world. Designing for that, not every teacher in every class, but it can be in an art class. It can be in a gym class. It can be in a history class and whatever. We have to have one-to-one coverage of kid to experience and relationships that allow those things to happen. And then all the content that John is talking about can take hold, right? So that's, I think, what we really need to understand of how do we build the readiness, both the emotional and the intellectual readiness of a teen to get excited about power, right?
Yeah, yeah. And you do a really nice job in your article of laying out the key, like these key design principles that really, kind of disrupt the current model or the common model, shall we say, of, kids in seats with a textbook and so forth and so on. You talk about relationships, you talk about context, and a lot of project-based learning allows students to define for themselves how they want to, understand and explore things around them that are civically related, happening in their community, having happened in their community historically. Build those skill sets, because that creates relevancy, it creates meaning, it helps the student anchor themselves. Say a little bit more about those aspects of what different might look like in a school.
Well, one of my favorite examples is truly the system that's been set up in Metro Kansas City, right? Where they have just made real world learning a mandate across all different subject areas. And in the world of the humanities and in history, real world learning, whether it's in art or English or history or whatever, becomes a project where young people are creating something of value to a community institution, an archive, a library, a cultural institution, and seeing experiences like that, collecting oral histories and then putting them in the library, putting on an exhibit, creating a tour for young people, creating an educational resource for third graders, right? Where the kids are both learners and teachers or advisors, right? Where they get to step into a role of someone who has agency. There you see learning taking hold that isn't just They're absorbing the information, but because it's relevant, because it has an audience, because it matters and they matter as the transmitter of the information, it has this massively powerful effect on them in their sense of self, right? Like I remember one of my favorite examples was this 8th grader who was in a charter school that was for particularly challenging students that we usually fell through the other schools and they would then come into this charter school. And he was part of a team that designed tours through the Truman Library based on topics they were interested in. And first he wanted to do it about guns. And we were like, can we do science and technology instead of just guns? He was like, sure, I'll do science and technology. So he made this tour. He was a very quiet kid. And then at the end, they ended up doing the tour, and it was supposed to be only for their peers, but then it became public because the library decided to be open that day. And so all of a sudden, this little 8th grader kid who's super shy and has never spoken in public is presenting to 100 strangers. And his reflection afterwards was like, it was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life because I get bullied by my peers. I'm overweight. I don't look good. I'm not in the norm of what they find cool. But the adults thought I was awesome. They were eating up what I had to say. I love public speaking. This is so fun. So watching an experience like that, it wasn't like designed as a civics project, but when a history or a humanities project becomes an opportunity for a young person to find their curiosity, their interest, their voice, their role in a public space, holding an American story, like holding history in his hands as a storyteller. It's fun. That becomes sort of an experiential civics moment that lights off those light bulbs that I was talking about, right? That sense of confidence and competence in being able to master that role of a storyteller and as a mediator of something. So those kind of experiential projects that allow young people to go into community, even if it's just their local community, right? It can be the 3rd grade where they're teaching them about the First World War or whatever it is. That relevance is tremendously important. And I think that the state board in Missouri and did a great job of making that flexibility around the Carnegie unit and the seat time. They're like, we are going to make real world learning 24-hour market value asset, real world learning. That's what we're going to do. Every class can do it anytime, 24-hour block. And that becomes something that you can then shorten your curriculum. Doesn't matter what subject you're in, but for the 24-hour block, you get to do that. So that kind of freedom for something that is experiential and in community, I think is a fantastic example of that kind of thing.
Yeah. Which now I'm going to take it to Ian, because Ian, you're a student, you're actually doing the kinds of things that were just talked about. So say a little bit about, what inspired you to start or promote Student Voice Connect. Say a little bit about, how that came to be, what it looks like, and how it's going.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I think oftentimes throughout this conversation, we've talking about getting students curious about learning, having these learning experiences where students can just not sit in a class all day and just pay attention to a presentation, but get experiences to really help them learn. So with that information and also the understanding that principals in our states are network, teachers are network, superintendents are network, local leaders are network, even state leaders are network, because that's why we have NASBE. But why aren't students network? Why can't students in my state, for example, in North Carolina, come together to advance policy ideas they have this experience? So that really launched the inspiration I had for Student Voice Alliance. And with Student Voice Alliance, we really tried to figure out how do we engage students in policy. So what we did is we do a lot of surveys. We engage students with surveys, and we just don't let the survey data collect dust. We present data on issues such as cell phones or class rank, issues students are engaged with, issues students have perspectives on that oftentimes aren't uplifted. Before in the cell phone conversation in North Carolina, we weren't really hearing students. So I'm like, you know what, this needs to change. So we did a survey and we got the governor's office to look at our data, the legislators to look at our data. Our state board, of course, looked at the data, but it's just about using that. And I also hear continuously from students, I think one of the things we have to think about in civics education is we often feel we focus, I think, a lot on federal issues, and oftentimes students are very passionate about federal issues, but there also is that state and local issue that has a lot of weight, right? State and local government matters a huge amount. And on that front, we decided that we need local school boards to have a student voice because local government is important. Not every student sees that, but they are important. Just today, I had a conversation with a group of students that were trying to bridge an issue on personal finance, and like, this is not a state thing, this is a local thing. And so that launched our idea for doing an ambassador program, which we'll pilot next year, where we're going to have a student ambassadors in select school districts in North Carolina to continue to raise and be local school board members so they can raise really that student perspective. But the work's been great. I've gotten a lot of enthusiasm, and we just recently in Tuesday expanded and doing some work in Hawaii. So we want to help equip those students because they came to me with a want, and I said, let's do it. And now we're going to create a program where they can go lobby at their legislature. It's just about students have that activism. They have that activism, but we just need to meet them where they're at and give them the tools. So if that's surveys, if that's equipping them to serve on their local school boards, or equipping them with the skills to lobby their legislature, that's what we have an obligation to do.
That's amazing. Thank you, Ian. And I'm not going to let you go without talking a little bit about what goes on in your school. If I were to walk into your school tomorrow, well, tomorrow's Saturday, but on a school day, what would I see? Would it still look a lot like maybe the school I went to, or what are the kinds of things happening in your school that maybe are responsive to this idea of giving students greater agency, maybe a greater role in designing and being flexible with the learning experience? Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the first things that comes to my mind is, my school, we're lucky, we have a lot of resources. So we received the opportunity to recently pilot a class through the Smithsonian, and it's called Asian American Studies. And we're doing a partnership with the Smithsonian with a virtual school. And it's very interesting. And what I like about this class is, we're exploring a certain subgroup in America, and the Smithsonian pilot is called Democracy and Dialogue. But what I really like about it is our teacher, he gives students a chance to contribute to what they want to learn. He asks us, what do you want to learn about? How do you want to shape? What issues matter to you with these groups? And he formulates his lessons plans around what students seek. And additionally, with this being through the Smithsonian, we have a lot of different resources we can leverage. We have the ability to collaborate with peers and other schools. And that's just really, for me, what I enjoy doing and what my classmates enjoy doing. But on the other hand, I would say some of my classes, oftentimes, I think students do it just to take a credit. They do it to take a credit, and they just don't see the point of what they're learning, because there's a bridge between, hey, I'm getting this content, but what am I actually going to do with it? Why do I need to learn about civics? And I think that's an issue. And again, I just don't see enough of teaching about state and local government. And I think that's an important aspect. So a lot of students, for them, I think this is important, and they're focusing through our education a lot on federal issues. But I do think that state and local issues hold a lot of weight.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's great. I appreciate your reflecting that way. And again, your notion about, students crave relevancy, right? They want to, like what, and a lot of times we think about, like, in algebra 2, when am I ever going to use this? But in history, there's the same sort of, like, what relevance does this have to me? And it's not that hard to find that relevance, but it really takes a creative approach to the instructional, experience, right? To kind of either make those connections or start with, like you said, what do you want? What do you see around you that you're curious about from a historian's perspective, and then apply history practices to that thing that both build your skills as a historian, but then build your skills in civic engagement and help explain the kinds of things that you're scratching your head saying, I wonder why this is the way it is, or I wonder what this is all about over here. Bernice, I'm going to take it to you, because in some ways, students reach the pinnacle of civic engagement when they become members of the State Board of Education in the District of Columbia. Talk about the value that those students bring to the work of the board, and in some ways maybe how your board got to that.
Absolutely. Well, I will say that we have 4 student representatives on the board, And by far, they are the most engaged, um, most curious, most challenging, in like the best kind of way. It was like, well, how are you going to pay for that? How are teachers going to take on this? And our adults get a little bit like, oh, we have to answer questions before it even gets to the vote of the rest of the adults. They really have to engage there. But I think it really, for the state board and DC, just is around like aligning around the purpose, the processes, and the people. So it's like the why is in the purpose. Like, why do they want to have the student voice? And I think long before I got to the DC State Board, the members of the state board and the staff really wanted to find a way, like, how do we make like the policy and the things that we do not be things that are done to students in DC, but done with them, that are co-designed, that are co-owned, that are co-led. And that was their purpose. And so they started with that question, how can we make them a deeper part of the process? And I think one of the things that, I don't know if it's just in the air here in DC or just ingrained in the nation's capital, is like civic education and history and democracy is like sort of the lifeblood of the District of Columbia. And so it even when they were redoing our social studies standards, the fact that our community was so engaged in it. And it was like, well, how do we shift it from high school? So now all eighth grade students have to do action civics. That is built into the education standards in like the new set that we did. And so they got aligned on the purpose, and then they started to build in the processes. So everything from, oh, first they had 2 student reps, and it was like, no, we need more student reps. We need great. DC has a lot of students, they have different voices, different perspectives from all over the world. How do we create space for more? And so they added 2 additional seats, which brought it to 4. And I just remember last year, every year that I've been here, the number of applications we get for those 4 seats, it just like it gets more and more complex. We've had to come up with different, like, how do we send this in the package of the essay questions? And I remember one of our members, oh, we should like have, maybe we should have, recommendations, or we should have like people who make certain grade point average. And the staff was like, no, we're not creating barriers for entry. If you want to be a part of the state board, we want you to just be comfortable being here and want to be here. Because if we don't want to be based on whether or not you can get the most recommendations from your teachers or whether you have the highest grade point average, but really it's like, is this work where you want your voice to be seen? Do you have a point of view that other students share that needs to be heard? And so we've generated like dialogue around that part of the application process. And so, but from that bore our student advisory committee. We kept getting so many students for the student reps. Now we have student advisory committee where we are like, we keep growing out of our space where we hold these meetings, because more and more we don't turn down students. So that is the thing. If you are from 10th to if you're a sophomore, junior, senior, and you apply to be on our student advisory committee, we say yes. We are not the place that's going to tell you no, only the cool, smart kids with the money can do it. If you want to be in the room, you can be in the room. You can take a leadership role. You can make sure that your voice is heard. And so we create the space for that. But that becomes part of the process. It's like, how do we get that now? How do we make sure that all of these students and all of their ideas about what's happening around their education, with their education, about their views, gets heard? And so the state board then decided, how do we build this into our bylaws? So now before anything can be voted on or brought before the state board, it has to go to our student advisory committee to get their input, any edits or questions this is before it gets to the members. So then if a state resolution or a piece of legislation has some concerns or edit, then the people get to take it back and revise it and maybe present it again. And if for whatever reason they still can't come to agreement, and this is the part I like about it, we have the 4 student reps who chair that student advisory committee. And sometimes when it comes to the vote, they don't vote with the adults. They was like, our student advisory committee voted against this. They read their statement on the record. It was this many votes for and against, and they have sincere, legitimate, honest reasons. And I think that sometimes also sways the other adults to either support or not support an issue, because our young people have been incredibly thoughtful about it. And there are some times when, great, everybody agrees, but there's some tweaks and there's some questions. And because, the adults in the room aren't in classrooms every day. They can't tell you, like, they can't, if you want to ban cell phones, but none of us are in school collecting phones. But students can tell you, well, my teacher tried to collect phones and this is the disruption it caused. Or this went well and they changed it up the next year. Like, they have this real life experience that needs to be valued. That experiential experience in the day-to-day education of their lives is just as valuable as an adult's law degree or their engineering experience or their public policy experience, because that is the experience in which like our country was founded by young people who were excited, who wanted to shake things up, who did not like the way things were going, and they got involved. So I think once you have that, like, so we built in those processes in our state bylaws for the state board. And so, and we really, to the point where there are only two standing committees for the DC State Board. It is our administrative committee and our student advisory committee. Everything else can go away. They're ad hoc in nature, but those two cannot. And so, like, again, you have to show that you are committed to not just hearing from students, but making them equal footing with the adults in the space and being very comfortable with that, so that they aren't intimidated and they're encouraged to ask the hard questions. And I think last, which is probably work, is having the right people to help cultivate this energy. And I think at the DC State Board, we have Dr. Darren Fleischer, who is just absolutely dedicated. He's a former, also I'll say, if you don't have former educators working with your state board, I feel like you're missing a piece of the secret sauce. And Dr. Fleischer is just, he knows how to get young people comfortable in their own leadership. So like literally they plan their agendas. He does not plan the agendas. He's there as a resource and they can bounce questions. He helps structure the other adults so that the young people in the space have what they need to feel comfortable. And I think that has gone a long way to grow our student advisory committee. Because now it's growing, not because of all the great work the DC State Board is doing, but now students are hearing about it from their friends. We are getting emails all times of year. Oh, can I be on the student advisory committee? Has it closed yet? Has it opened yet? And so it's becoming an exciting part. And so like now we're setting goals. Like, how do we get a student from every single high school in the district? So it's not just because there are so many issues and so many things that are happening. We really want to make sure that nobody's voice is left on the outside. Because in the work that's happening in the district, life that's happening in the district, the young people are going to be what really shifts the momentum. And so we just really want to create space for that, and everything from, again, knowing the why, ingraining this stuff into your SOPs and your bylaws, but then also making sure you have the staff that is going to be dedicated to helping support their student leadership and not doing the work for them, but helping create the conditions for their success.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I've got to believe you give that nice example of the advisory group disagreeing with the rest of the adult members. I mean, you know, managing disagreement is also an important skill that often, you know, we don't really have enough of, even among us adults. And so helping, and I'm sure within the advisory group, there are honest disagreements of opinion, and helping students understand how to navigate those waters in a way that leads to, you know, productive forward, you know, momentum, rather than, creating, conditions that are less conducive to the success of the organization. I think that's really, really important.
Well, Paolo, I think for our young people in the, like our SAC, they do an annual report. So their annual report, those are the issues that they care about. And when you read their report, it really talks about how, you know, maybe they didn't all agree on the same issues, but this is how they found a way to like bring this set of students' perspective to the forefront or make sure that that voice wasn't left out. And then they build work around that for the full year. And so we get to support that work and make sure that, you know, in addition to the work, like this is the work of the state board. It isn't like apart from the work of the state board. This is also our work.
They're listening to each other. They're respectful. They're inquisitive.
Yes.
They're humble. You know, a lot of times it's hard for people to admit when they're wrong, and sometimes that's an important skill to cultivate as well, and being able to shape your own point of view after you have different perspectives brought to the table. Very good. I want to remind those listening in that we do happy to take your questions. I don't see any in the Q&A function, but I would encourage you, if you do have some, to put them there. It's not often that you'll see this collection of great thinkers and doers around this issue of student engagement. So please step forward with your questions. I guess we've got a few minutes left, so what I really want to do is ask you each to maybe reflect on our primary audience are the policymakers that sit on state boards of education. And I think many of them who are listening today might be saying to themselves, okay, well, what could I do? What could I do differently? Or what conversation could I start in my state that might have an impact? I know one of the things that got mentioned a couple of times was about teacher preparation, and that teacher preparation and teacher, education, professional development always reminds me that our tremendous deployed infrastructure of education is often change averse, right? There's a certain inertia out there that we like to do things the way we've always done things, and some of the ideas that have surfaced in this conversation are different. So, but I won't limit your comments to that. If you want to comment on what we should be doing in professional development, please do so. But what other kinds of things can state boards be thinking about or maybe acting on to advance this cause? I don't know who wants to go first.
I could start. I would double click on investing in teachers from pre-service to retirement, right? And particularly, I came through that pipeline, right? And the extent to which, as we prepare social studies teachers, the extent to which there's exposure to content that's heavy on the history side, but very light on the civics kind of political science side. And then also light on the pedagogy side, these student-centered practices that we're talking about. So that needs to be embedded in pre-service programs. And then more importantly, maybe we need these opportunities throughout our career. And in my experience in doing this work, particularly in Illinois, those opportunities are abundant in metropolitan areas. There's still issues of accessing those opportunities, but that as you get outside of metropolitan areas, they're very scarce. And teachers tell us that there's very little funding for professional development in civics. There's a dearth of school leadership support for that. So that is key. The other piece I'd say is we were part of a group called the Educating for American Democracy, or put together something called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap in 2021, which lays out, and it's actually featured in one of the articles in this issue, right? Some of the principal investigators lays out a vision for teaching civics in American history and also articulates some of those student-centered pedagogies. And I think state boards would be really wise to consult that document. There were over 300 contributors. It's a very pluralistic vision, wrestles with some of the tensions that we've wrestled with here today. And as states think about revisiting their standards, I'd say if I were to speak broadly about standards, there is a dearth of focus on content. They are pretty skills or kind of inquiry heavy across the board, which is fantastic. But what the EAD roadmap does is really marries those two things together. So it would really encourage states to take a look at that roadmap, particularly as they revisit state social studies standards.
Nice. Ian, what are your thoughts on the subject?
In addition to agreeing on, of course, educator preparation, I also would just add I think state boards are in a unique position, and state policymakers to really help foster partnerships for local school districts and schools with really what I would say nonprofits or other civics and get local governments. What can we do to foster these connections so that way we can have it so that way students in class can maybe be partnered with a local nonprofit that's engaged in voter registration, or can we have it so that way they're near let's say the state legislature? Can they do partners with something to do where students go to the legislature and learn every month? I think these partnerships are going to be key, and that's something lawmakers have to do. But they also have got to statewide support local school districts and giving opportunities like what Ms. Butler said is going on in DC. I mean, that is awesome. And we need to make sure that state lawmakers can support local school districts and ensuring that students have a voice, because I look at my local school district, there's about 115 school districts. I believe only 2 actually really have a student voice at the local school board table. That number needs to be increased, but not all local school boards have the capability or the model to do so. So we need to support our local school districts, and within schools themselves, school improvement is a big thing. Schools are always improving. Why can't we have students sit on school improvement teams? Some schools do that, some schools don't, but I think it would be a great thing for state policymakers to listen and build on.
No, that's great. I love what you said about creating greater partnerships, because I think when we think about project, the example that Fernande did about the Truman Museum, I mean, there's a partnership. And even though we often think about our museums as being very urban, it's like every county has a historical society. Every community has a cemetery, or church records, or things that have happened that are on historical markers or what have you. I mean, all those things in one way, shape, or form can form that connective tissue that can help promote some of the pedagogical and learning opportunities that we've talked about today.
Yeah, Paul, I would say, because I grew up in one of those rural towns in Georgia, 4,000 people. And the thing that brought the civics to life is that it was everything that Ian said. It was the fact that, yes, we were in school, but they also partnered with 4-H that I did from the time I was in 3rd grade until I graduated 12th grade. Like, that got me comfortable with public speaking. That taught me, oh, well, there was no funding for a DPA camp and to send the kids to the competition. So now then a group of us went to, the school board meeting. Of course, it wasn't part of the school budget because it wasn't a school program per se. It was a county extension program, but you had a group of kids who wanted to go. So then like it really became part of the work that built our experience as young people. And so Ian, I think you just hit the nail on the head. So
Yeah.
And
You've
just
got
two quick things.
You've got scouting programs. You've got libraries, librarians love being asked to help explore certain issues and what have you. Go ahead, Fernande. I didn't mean to
I was just saying, I think two things to drive that. So there are two big barriers on that. One of them is obviously the funding for travel, sometimes when kids can't get there. And the other is setting a clear outcome, so a way to credential it. Or a way to sort of show that this matters, right? So you say if they're doing something, you have to be able to say what you're looking for when they do it so that you can say whether it worked or not. Because if you don't, it's just doing a field trip and no one has time or money for field trips. So what you want to do is to say, we want kids to develop a sense of belonging and curiosity and agency, whatever it is, like whatever your metric is, and then say, we are going to do this project so that when they do it, I can assess, how did this go for you? And the kids 100% of the time are like, oh my God, this was amazing. I got so much more connected, blah, blah, blah. But without the metric, it's never going to be something that becomes institutionalized, right? It just is nice to have, and nice to have. No one has money for nice to have. But that helps you then create a conversation with students. What do you want? I want things that engage me. I want things that connect me with my community. I want things that are real, right? Real world pathways into careers, right? I want to know how I can get a job in this space. So I think connecting it to pathways, creating assessment tools, being really clear, connecting it to your profile of a learner is another piece if you have one, and being flexible with seat time, and then thinking about how you fund those kind of things. So maybe less time for high stakes tutoring or less money for that and more money for buses or support to get kids to places where they really can have meaningful experiences. Like, I don't know what the balance is, but to be clear that you need money to do this kind of thing sometimes and support those collaborations of teachers with community orgs. It just takes time. It's relationships, right? It's not a computer algorithm. It's humans that need to know that there are humans who have got their back.
Great. I think everybody's had a chance to weigh in. Are there any other final comments? One of the things I will say is I do want to remind people once again that we've published a great deal in the state education standard on this topic. If you enjoyed reading about this, then feel free to track that down. And we always stand here at NASBE as a resource to follow up on things. So if you have questions about anything in the standard or want to explore these issues further, we're happy to do that. I would also be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for the organizations that are represented on the call today. Both iCivics and the History CoLab are amazing organizations. They speak beautifully, I think, to this notion of teacher professional development. If a teacher is listening to this conversation, or if you know a teacher who has an itch to do more around student agency and engagement, both iCivics and the History CoLab can be a great resource for that. I mean, and I'd ask the two of you, do you want to rattle off a few other organizations that are also out there that would be good resources?
Yeah, I would just say quickly, Center for Civic Education and the Bill of Rights Institute, and have to sign up, but really appreciate this opportunity and great to spend time with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shawn. You also have places like the Smithsonian, and I'm sure your local historical state history societies, local history societies all have various resources that in one way, shape, or form could intersect with what it is we're.
I just want to throw in Thinking Nation is another great one. They think a lot about competency-oriented civic learning. I've done a ton of thinking about how to do teacher PD in a way that really works.
Yeah, and in the Standard, there's a really nice interview that I did with Zach Cote, who heads up Thinking Nation, on history dispositions and how those interface with civic learning. With that, I want to thank our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be part of this, for writing for us. Thank you to everybody who's in attendance. Thank you to the team that helped put together this event. Keep up the great work everybody does each and every day in the interest of student success, and never hesitate to reach out to us at NASBE if we can be of assistance to you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Paolo. Thank you all.
Thank you all.